With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Welcome in, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. We certainly do appreciate you choosing to make us a part of your day every day, and we especially appreciate it on this Tuesday. So thank you so much for being with us. We are, as always, thrilled to be with you, and there is quite a bit of local news to get to, not the least of which is the Luv Gov. That's right, Governor Robert Bentley is back in the news. Now, you would think that Governor Bentley, being a very smart individual, would have the good sense to try to stay out of the news as much as humanly possible for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, this does not seem to be the case. Governor Bentley has now said that he is at least open to the idea of a Senate run. He is at least open to the idea of running to represent the state of Alabama in the Senate at the United States. And there's a couple moving parts of this. First of all, we'll take a statement from WVNN, which is one of our affiliates with Cumulus Radio up in Huntsville. He actually gave an interview and he said, and I quote, "Doors open and doors close. And you know, I never close doors completely. If the opportunity arises and things work out the way they should, then we may consider it." Now, not to put too fine a point on it, but isn't not closing doors completely what got you in trouble in the first place? I believe that's how you got caught, Governor Bentley. And just, as a general rule, I think that once you marry somebody, you should pretty much close the doors on any extramarital relationships, and apparently it's Governor Bentley's refusal to close doors completely that is the reason he was ousted as the governor of Alabama, and the reason that he has had to take that deal, which specifically stated that he will not run for office again. Now, you may ask the question, well, if that was part of the deal, that he wound up not facing criminal charges because he took that deal and was going to not have to face prosecution specifically because part of his agreement was he would not run for office, wouldn't that mean he can't run for Senate in the first place? Wouldn't that mean that his mind is made up for him? Well, actually, according to the governor, no. Now, I would actually disagree with that characterization, but the truth is, this is essentially what the case that he's trying to make for people. And the case that he's trying to make for people right now is that because that deal was a deal with the state of Alabama, running for federal office technically doesn't count. Now, here's the thing. This is an agreement, and it is in essence a legal contract. It is an agreement by the governor, and it is law-abiding, but it is not in and of itself a law. In other words, the contract is bound by legal constraints, and Governor Bentley is obliged by the law to uphold it, but it's important to remember that the agreement itself is not a state law. It was not something that passed through the Congress and the Senate and all of that. This is specifically an agreement that was reached by the governor, and so it is not constrained only to state offices. That's a weak sauce argument. Now, you guys know, me being the federalist that I am, I believe that the separation of federal and state power is very important, and it's something that our country has largely lost. But that is not something that applies here. This was a legal contract, and I think any fair-minded individual would look at this and say, the way that that agreement was worded, it seems as though it intended any elected office. Now, maybe he could theoretically even run for a state office in a different state if he moved. I don't know. But the point is this idea that, well, that agreement was done specifically in the mindset of those involved where he wasn't going to run for a state office again. I don't think so. That's a pretty weak argument if you ask me. I don't think that there's a legal loophole out of that. Because if we're going to say, well, it's too vague and inspecific, so the governor couldn't have possibly known that he was agreeing at the time to not run for federal office, well, then can you put any stipulation on it? Can you say, because it just says not run for office, that what it really meant was specifically the county clerk or specifically a constitutional office in the state of Alabama? I mean, if you want to get specific with this, if you're trying to say that it's so vague that it means nothing, then it essentially makes the agreement ineffective. Why would federal office specifically be excluded from that understanding when he signed that agreement? And so I'm not saying that there's no legal argument here, but if there is, it's a very, very sketchy technicality. And I just do not believe that just because this deal doesn't specify that federal office would be included in that, especially considering that he would be a representative of the state of Alabama, and this would be a statewide election to decide who gets to be that representative. I get that it's a federal office, but you're also representing the state of Alabama in a federal capacity. You're still serving the state of Alabama in an elected capacity. You're just doing so differently than the last way. And if you can justify this, you could justify him running for just about any office. Maybe except for the governorship itself. You could justify running for any office despite this agreement. So this is a very shaky legal argument at best. But I will say this. I don't think it's going to matter. Could be wrong. Been wrong before, and goodness knows my track record on predicting elections is not great. I'm much better at looking at policy. I'm much better at looking at the winds and the political winds and the way they're going to go when it comes to specific issues. I'm not that great at predicting elections and who winds up getting in office or not. I'm probably better than the average person, but it's certainly not my specialty. It's not my forte, as it were. And so maybe I'm wrong on this, but I don't think I am. There are some political realities that I don't understand, but I can still acknowledge that they are true. For example, even though it makes no sense whatsoever, there is polling data that shows that of the Republicans that are being at least thought about right now as the possible replacement for Senator Doug Jones, right now Roy Moore is doing very well, doing better than anybody else. Now, does that make any sense at all? No, absolutely none. And did I see that coming? Nope. Do I think that he should run anyway? No, I absolutely think he shouldn't run. However, I acknowledge that it is true. I acknowledge that there is real, hard, substantial evidence that shows that, at least right now, as the polls stand, he is the most popular out of the potential Republican candidates to run against Doug Jones. I think if the Republicans wind up nominating him through a primary, that's incredibly idiotic. But nonetheless, I can acknowledge that that is true. I've not seen anything like that with Governor Bentley. Nothing. I don't see even a hint of a political appetite for him. With Roy Moore, even though I don't understand it, there are people that really do loyally defend Roy Moore, and the rationale that I believe is behind it is they feel like he got a raw deal and that they were lying, which I believe that they were, lying about him and embellishing the truth, and they essentially manufactured a crisis. They manufactured this whole long storied history of him being some kind of sexual predator and a pedophile. And at least from that perspective, I do understand that there's a little bit of a revenge vote going on, that there are people that because these allegations were not well-founded, and they're probably what caused him to lose the election, that there are people that loyally support Moore sort of as a backlash or an overcorrection as a result of the previous special election against Doug Jones. I'm not getting a sense that that exists whatsoever with Governor Bentley. There are a handful, and I mean a very small number of people that actually still support Governor Bentley. They're out there, but not to the level that Roy Moore is. And you have to remember that Luther Strange really should have walked away with his election against Doug Jones and against Roy Moore pretty easily. Like, he should have really won that primary and then soundly defeated Doug Jones. Why did he not? Because he still had the stench of corruption on him. Whether or not it was actually corrupt or not, I don't know. But all the scenarios and all the circumstances surrounding it were incredibly fishy, that Governor Bentley basically nominated him to be the senator from Alabama to shut him up and keep him from investigating him. That was the idea. And so, just because Luther Strange was essentially Governor Bentley adjacent, he struggled in a primary that he really should have won easily. And so because of that, I'm seeing that as a pretty strong indication that there is absolutely no political appetite for Governor Bentley to enter this race. Maybe I'm wrong. Goodness knows I've been wrong before, but I'm just saying, based on what I know and what I've heard from other people, I don't think I'm wrong on this one. I think I'm dead right on this one. I don't think that there's any large plurality of Republicans that are just itching to throw Governor Bentley in, especially when you consider that there are lots of better options, like Mo Brooks, like Jim Ziegler, that could potentially fulfill that role. And so I don't think that he has legal standing, but I also don't really think that it matters, to be perfectly honest. If that makes sense. I think that he won't win the legal argument that he's allowed to run, but even if he did, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference, because I don't see the voters supporting him in the primary or in the general. But nonetheless, that's where we go. My sort of final wrap up on that would be, Governor Bentley, just go home. At a certain point, it's kind of like Governor Bentley is that guy at the party that can't detect that nobody wants him there. Like, he shows up and he's making a fool out of himself, and he wasn't invited in the first place, and for whatever reason he's convinced that people want him there, but nobody actually does. That's kind of how I sense this whole thing with Governor Bentley. Governor Bentley, read the room. Time for you to go home. That would be the best way that I would know to describe it. Look, I'm not somebody that thinks that you're beyond the point of forgiveness or repentance or any of that, but I do think you're way past the point to where people can trust you in public office and trust you with decision making that would go on, especially at a level like the United States Senate. So just stay out of politics, live out the rest of your life practicing medicine and trying to figure out your life, spend it with your family. I don't wish any ill towards you. I don't hate you or anything like that, but I don't think getting into the realm of politics benefits you or benefits anybody in the state of Alabama. Now, that being said, let's look at his potential opponent for a moment, Doug Jones, even though, like I said, I don't think that he's going to make it to the primary to even see Doug Jones. But Doug Jones essentially wants to limit the state of Alabama's influence on the national stage. And the reason I know that is because he was tweeting this out earlier. You can see this. This is a tweet by Doug Jones. This is just real simple, folks. We have to count everybody, all caps, everybody, to do otherwise is a disservice to Alabama and America. Why political experts believe in the 2020 census is critical for Alabama. All right, so before we get into the actual meat of this and actually go to substance, just a general rule, and I've said this on the show before. If you are tweeting in all caps, stop it. Just stop it. All caps, especially if you're doing the entire message. I've seen people do that too, where the whole thing is in caps, and Donald Trump is a frequent offender of this rule. Don't type in all caps. There is no reason for anybody to ever type in all caps. And the second that you do, people stop taking you seriously, and should. So that's the first thing. Don't type in all caps. The second thing, the article that Doug Jones posted with that tweet and him saying that we need to count everybody, it's important for you to really understand the backstory and the context of all this. There is a debate going on right now in Washington as to whether or not we should be asking the question on the census of whether the people being counted in the census are legal immigrants or not. Now, here's the thing. If you look through the Constitution, it's kind of vague as to what constitutes representation in the states for the House of Representatives and for the Electoral College, because, of course, how many members you have in the House determines how many electoral votes you get, so those two things are tied in with one another. But nonetheless, just going ahead and looking at that, I think that it's pretty clear based on the larger context that they were specifically talking about citizens when you're talking about representation. But even so, I actually think that it is a good thing that illegal immigrants take the census. And here's the reason. I want to know how many of them are there. I want to know how many of the people out there that are not citizens, that are not here legally, are actually living in our cities and our towns and in our country as a whole. And so I don't mind having the question on there and then marking legal or illegal or whatever, but I don't think that we should be counting them as part of the representation because they are not citizens. The government exists by the citizens, and it exists to serve the citizens. The illegals are not part of that equation. What's the first word of the Constitution? The first phrase, we the people. What people? It's not talking about people in Germany or Britain. They just fought a war to get out from under Britain's thumb. Clearly, they were talking about the citizens of the United States. The citizen is the one that the Constitution applies to. Therefore, it's pretty clear to me that what they were talking about is representation of citizenship. That being said, I don't have a problem counting illegal immigrants just so we can get kind of a general idea of how many of them are here. But we shouldn't be using their numbers to bolster any state, regardless of which state it is, any state's representation in the House or in the Electoral College. That's not something that we should be considering. And what Doug Jones seems to be implying here based on this article that he presented, because the article he presents tries to make the case that essentially counting everyone, which would include illegal immigrants, and counting them as part of the representation would really help the state of Alabama. That what it would do is if we were able to count them, then we might be able to stave off losing a seat in the House of Representatives. But here's the reason why that doesn't work. Let's just say that were the case, and by counting illegal immigrants along with our citizens and those that are here legally, let's say that if we did that and we continued to maintain our 7 seats, you have to ask the question, what is that going to do to the entire country? Because you can't get too narrow-sighted and just look at how it's going to affect your state. You have to look at how it's going to affect the entire country. Well, you're going to have border states like Arizona and California and New Mexico and Texas that are all of a sudden going to get a boost in their representation. And if that boost in representation is reflected because of being able to count illegal immigrants as the same as citizens, well, what that does is the same thing as any other voter fraud. It dilutes the effectiveness of your individual vote. And so either scenario that we go into where illegal immigrants are counted, Alabama's vote goes down. Either what happens is it doesn't make an effect and we wind up losing a seat in the House and losing one of our electoral votes, or we count everybody that's illegal and it does wind up saving one of those seats, but then other states that have a larger illegal immigrant population has more representation, thus making our votes count for less, thus making our votes a smaller percentage of the overall House of Representatives and Electoral College. So what I'm saying here is, if we didn't count illegal immigrants, yes, we do run the risk of losing one of our seats of representation. That is possible. We lose one of our seats in the House. That's a possibility. But it is a guarantee that if we count illegal immigrants, one way or the other, whether we lose that seat or not, Alabama's influence in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College is going to be diminished at least somewhat. And so that's the reason that Doug Jones is really supporting this. He's not doing this because he wants Alabama to continue to be represented at the level that it is now. It is because he knows regardless of how many numbers we actually gather, it's going to be less than a lot of those border states, especially California. And so what that's going to do is that's going to lessen the influence of the state of Alabama. And the reason that that is a win for him is because what he wants, ultimately, is the Democrat agenda. And the large plurality of Alabama, with the exception of one of our representatives, is very red, very Republican. And we would presumably lose one of those representatives in the 2020 census if that were to take place, which would mean it is easier on the national stage for the Democrats to get their election through, especially when you're broadening that not just to Alabama, but across the Southeast. And if that happens, Doug Jones gets his way. You see, because the thing about Doug Jones is, and this is a rule that kind of helps explain all of his behavior, he really is a Democrat senator first, and an Alabama senator in a far, far distant second. He is chiefly concerned with the Democrats getting their way, and whatever representation Alabama has, if that's diminished, that's actually a win for him because that helps the Democrats on the national stage, which is really the end goal. And to sort of, not to beat a dead horse, but certainly to help prove my point, Mo Brooks and Attorney General Marshall are actually suing the Fed over this issue. Now, I just laid out that Doug Jones has a very clear motive for Alabama's influence on the national stage to be diminished and for us to have less representation. Mo Brooks and Attorney General Marshall have no such motivation, because Mo Brooks would want, presumably, Alabama to have as much representation as possible because the vast majority of Alabamians are similar to him in political philosophy, and so the only way that his agenda winds up getting through, or at least if Alabama had more representation theoretically, then it would be more likely that the ideas and the policy that he wants wind up passing. And so you really have to look at the motives here to understand this. But Mo Brooks and Steve Marshall are actually suing the Fed because they're afraid that this is going to diminish Alabama's influence, and they have no motive to do anything else because their state gets more representation if this takes place. It would make no reason for them to want less representation from the state of Alabama. And Governor Ivey actually points this out and points out the urgency of it as well. She said earlier, if we do not reach maximum participation, we will be at serious risk of losing a congressional seat and, very importantly, federal funding for Alabama. Both of these are critical for our state's future. And Governor Ivey is exactly right there. That we do need maximum participation. We do want as many people that are legal citizens participating in the census as possible. Now, I don't agree with her weird dependency on the Fed and the reason that she thinks it's so important that Alabama gets federal funding. That's one thing that I actually don't like about Governor Ivey. But nonetheless, she's right that it is crucial for us to maximize our representation as much as possible. But the point is, Doug Jones is supporting a policy that wouldn't do that. And I'll bring this up too, and I want to give credit where credit's due. Our friend Del Jackson up in Huntsville, who is one of the other hosts for Cumulus Radio. He's in our sisterhood of networks, as it were. But he said the other day, he brought up the fact that if you think of what Doug Jones is doing as trying to get reelected to the Senate, none of his actions make any sense. And he's right on that. Because even though he kind of tries to hide it and he still sort of tries to paint himself as a moderate blue dog when he's talking to Alabamians and then talks about how incredibly liberal he is everywhere else, including when he fundraises in other states, which supply far more of his campaign money than Alabama does, it really doesn't make sense to continue to support these policies, especially as close as he is to an election. And I said a long time ago, based on the way that he's voting, that I believe that Doug Jones has already seen the writing on the wall, and he said, you know what, the chances of me getting elected again are probably nothing, so I'm just going to vote the way that I want to. But Del Jackson actually added a second layer to that, which I think may make a lot of sense. One of the things that he brought up, which I think sheds some light on this, is that does it make more sense for Doug Jones to do all these actions if he's trying to get elected in the state of Alabama? Really, no. If he's doing so, if he's trying to get reelected, he's doing a terrible job of it. But if you were to all of a sudden look at this story in a different way, in other words, you were to look at this story as Doug Jones currying favor with the Democrats to perhaps get a important seat with Joe Biden's administration if he winds up defeating Trump, for example. Well, Attorney General Doug Jones sounds far more likely than Alabama Senator Doug Jones. And if you do look at all of his actions through that lens, through that idea that maybe what he's really doing is bucking for a high-ranking job in a Democrat administration, that does make a lot more sense. Because it's kind of like one of those things that, and this is the reason that I say context is so important, if you have the proper context, everything else just kind of snaps into place. That if you are looking at Doug Jones and his actions and the vote that he's taking, whether it comes to abortion, whether it comes to his stances on gun control, he's in favor of all the things that are super unpopular in the state of Alabama. But let's say that he has a really good relationship with Joe Biden. Joe Biden winds up winning the presidency in 2020, and he's saying to him, you know, Joe, I have a background in law, and I've been a senator from a very red state. It could really help out your administration to have somebody from the Deep South in your administration, in your inner cabinet. And so if you think about it in those terms, that Doug Jones may really be bucking more for a job in a Democrat administration or to solidify himself, at least in some way, on the national stage as a high roller in the Democrat Party, well, then all of the actions and all the votes that he's taking now make a lot more sense than if he was trying to get reelected in ruby red Alabama. And so that's the reason why I think that Dale Jackson's insinuation here actually does make quite a bit of sense. But this is just another prime example of Doug Jones being a Democrat senator first and an Alabama senator in a far, far distant second. And that's really the bottom line. Looks like we have a caller on line one, so we'll go ahead and go to the phones. Good afternoon. What's your name?
Oh, good afternoon.
Hey, what's on your mind?
Just wanted to defend the governor here with regard to something you said earlier about wanting federal funds for Alabama.
Right, Governor Ivey.
Governor Ivey. I think one of the ways that she would look at this, and you can react to it, however you feel, but she's thinking, well, we want to get the federal dollars we're supposed to get because our citizens are paying for that, and it's my job to represent them and fight for them in their behalf. So not to get the federal dollars, which are going to go somewhere, it might as well go to Alabama. That's probably what she's thinking.
I don't think that that's necessarily unfair because, and this is really one of the reasons that I hate the way that our system is set up now anyway. And I actually used this exact example with Common Core, which is another example of a big government program that the Fed controls and they delve out money. What they do is they essentially tax your citizens and then hold that money hostage.
Right.
And the way that it's the way that the Fed, in a roundabout way, sort of controls the states and imposes their will on the several states. Because what they do is they take money out of your pocket and they say, oh, we've got this giant pile of money. Sure would be a shame if your citizens didn't get any of that money back. So why don't you just do this on education? You apply these standards and then we'll give you that money that we took from you originally back. And so I'm not saying that Governor Ivey's stance on that is completely irrational. I would rather us just... The thing is, federal money always comes with strings attached. And I would rather us not have the strings attached, even if we were getting less money from the Fed, than I would for us to get that money and be beholden to them. You see what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying, but I also know this. Having been in career tech education, if you gave it back to the citizenry or the government of that it will be going to, for example, if it's Alabama, and you didn't earmark it in some way with some strings attached to it for career tech education, they might put it into, of all things, hiring more football coaches instead of putting it into hiring people for, say, agriculture education or automotive or, brick masonry or whatever it was. And that's one of the ways that this thing works. So instead of getting, God forbid, more football coaches, you would get it marked to where it needs to go.
Well, I'm definitely in favor of being able to get money where it needs to go. I'm just saying that what we've got to do is we've got to figure out a way to be more independent, because Alabama is one of the states that is most dependent on federal funding. And I know that would surprise most people because it's such a red state. But a lot of states like Alabama that are in the Deep South actually have a lot more federal money coming back to us than we're sending. And,
oh, yeah, absolutely.
And
I
it's
know that's the truth. But the governor has to look at it as a way of being able to get money for us that we deserve, and it's for the betterment or the benefit of our citizenry, as opposed to it going. They think of it as, well, it's going to go somewhere,
but
so
see,
it might as well come to our state.
but see that's what causes the vicious cycle, isn't it?
Oh, I agree. I agree.
You have all 50 states thinking that way, and that's why we have over $20 trillion in debt, is because all 50 states are trying to do that. And so I'm not saying that we abandon that money. I'm saying that the governor needs to make our state more independent on that level, and then it is the job of the delegation from the state of Alabama in the form of our House representatives and our senators to lower the taxes so that money isn't being taken from us in the first place. So I understand what you're saying, but I also think that that's really not the governor's job to try to get as much pork barrel spending towards our state as humanly possible. That's really not what Kay Ivey ought to be doing.
It's hard to explain if you don't try to fight for it, though.
Politically, yes, you're correct. Politically, yes, I agree. I mean, it's something
right.
that I see as wrong, but from a political standpoint, you're right.
Listen, you try to if I'm...
I think we just lost him there. Sorry about that. Yeah, we lost the connection. But anyway, well, it's about time for us to go to a break anyway, so we'll go to a break and we'll be back in just a moment.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will be from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verses 2 through 10. And a centurion's slave was sick and about to die. When he had heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come save the life of his slave. When they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built our synagogue." Now Jesus was triggered upon hearing this and said, "None of the good things he has done matter, because he is a slave owner, and we must never admit that anyone that ever owned slaves is capable of doing anything good. Furthermore, instead of asking me for help, you should have passed universal health care by now so that he could receive treatment for free." Then Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man placed under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it." Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, "I say to you, this man is engaged in systematic oppression. He is clearly engaging in wage slavery by controlling the means of production to exploit the labor of those around him." Then Jesus gathered up a mob and protested on the centurion's lawn all night long with torches and signs reading, "Down with the patriarchy," terrifying him and his family. We never really found out what happened to the centurion's slave. Wow. So inspiring. Thank you for listening to this reading of the SJW Bible, and remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And we're back. Thanks so much for sticking with us through the break. I got a comment here on Facebook from AJ, and he says, and I'm only quoting this because it's a direct quote from the page here. "What about all the caps and the people who type like this?" ? And he also uses the clappy hands emoji, which really just ticks me off more. I mean, if there's one thing that I hate more than the all caps, it's the clappy hands emoji. I despise the clappy hands emoji. You're not a 13-year-old girl, AJ. Knock it off with the emojis. Anyway, I turned into a grumpy old man there for a second. Get off my lawn. Anyway. All right. In all seriousness, well, not too serious. I did promise I was going to do my Avengers Endgame review today, so I'm not going to go real in depth on it. I'm just going to kind of give a general overview, and I'm going to do it spoiler free. So don't freak out. If I do accidentally give away a spoiler, I'm sorry, but I don't think that I will. So essentially, the main thing that I took away from it was, wow, they actually pulled it off. And I didn't think they were going to, because there was just such an insane amount of hype. Just a ridiculous, gargantuan level of hype. This is the first time in the history of America there has ever been a series that had anywhere close to this many movies. I would guess, if I had to think, maybe Rocky Balboa, that series, probably has a similar... I think it's got 8 now, doesn't it? Because you've got Rocky 1 through 5, and then Rocky Balboa is 6, and then the 2 Creed movies. So that would be 8, yeah. This one had 22. That's a lot. That's more than double Rocky. And you may have some straight-to-home TV movies like The Land Before Time that's got 18 at this point. But as far as big-budget, in the theater kind of movies, this is the only one that even comes close. And there was so much hype and so much build-up, and it's been over a decade that they've been working on this. It's bigger than Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings. And so the fact that they finally brought it all into one movie, and this is the culmination, this is the big finale of the whole series, and the way that they were actually able to bring it together, holy cow, they actually pulled it off. And to give you fair warning, and this was something that was speculated on, so I'm not really spoiling anything at this point, because this has just been everywhere, and it's more or less been confirmed by Marvel. There are other movies in the Marvel Universe that are going to come after this one. For example, you've probably even seen the trailers of Spider-Man Far From Home, which is coming out later this year. There is a Black Panther 2 that has been confirmed. But as far as the Marvel Universe, in other words, the Avengers series of films, this is it. Maybe they could change their mind later. But as far as the Avengers themselves, and what I'm talking about is Cap and Hulk and Iron Man and Black Widow and Hawkeye, all those guys, that core group, they're done. This was it. And I gotta say, I respect that. One of the anime series, for example, that I respect more than any of them is Full Metal Alchemist, and the reason that I do is a lot of animes drag on for so many seasons, and it seems like they never stop going because they're continuing to make money. The Full Metal Alchemist series basically just said, we're going to tell our story and then we're done. Because they were primarily concerned with the quality of the story itself. And I think that's kind of what Avengers did here. That they know they could make more money, they know they could make more movies, and maybe there was some fatigue from the actors, but they could have written around them in some way. And I'm sure that there are going to be future Marvel Universe movies and maybe even mashups like Civil War or like Ragnarok that featured Hulk and Thor. But as far as the big, massive Avengers movie saga, that's done. And I really respect them for having the courage to do that, as insanely profitable as this thing has been. And as far as story goes, there's a couple things that I did want to mention without, again, giving away any spoilers. You do have to watch all the movies first. And I'm fine with that. In fact, I prefer it. Because this movie rewards you for being a fan. And I love that when a series does that. You'll watch this, for example, in a lot of sitcoms. Seinfeld, for example. If you get into about season 8, season 7 of Seinfeld, you don't really understand half the jokes unless you're a fan of the show and have watched several episodes. It's not that you won't find it funny at all, it's just that there are a lot of jokes that are predicated on past experiences. The same could be true, you could say the same thing of How I Met Your Mother, to a degree Friends. And so knowing the characters makes it a much more enriching experience because you're not confused about what's going on. There's some nuances that even points that you'll understand, like the conflict or the humor. They make more sense when you have the context of the previous movies. And so for anybody that wants to see this movie that is asking, okay, which movies can I watch and which ones can I skip to watch this one? My advice, just watch all of them. And I know there will be people that get frustrated with that, but that's honestly my advice. If you want to really get everything that you can out of this movie, if you really want to enhance your enjoyment of it to the max, you got to watch every movie. And if you miss one, especially the Guardians, especially the Captain America movies, you're just going to be lost. There are a few that you could probably skip and not lose that much, but especially this one. And again, I'm really dancing around the spoilers here. This one, more than any of the other Marvel movies in the series, really depends on you knowing the Marvel Universe. It really depends on you knowing these characters and having an appreciation for what they've been through in the past movies. And there's going to be some points where you don't really understand what's going on unless you've seen all of them. But I mean, I'm not asking you to dig a canal. I'm asking you to watch a bunch of really enjoyable movies. So that would be my advice. You can't really skip any of the movies. You got to watch all of them. Another thing too, humor is really more abundant. In Infinity War, even though I thought it was a pretty good movie, the one thing that I thought was kind of lacking that the other Avengers movies had is there was a real abundance of humor. I mean, everybody remembers probably the most memorable scene in the first Avengers is actually not the big battle scene or that scene in the battle where they're doing the swirly camera thing where they're panning across all of them and you see all 6 Avengers finally assemble. The most memorable one is Hulk tearing into Loki, and then it was just so funny and so enjoyable. That's something that you're going to get a lot of in this movie. Infinity War kind of scaled the humor down a little bit. This one actually ratchets it up, and it's not overly cheesy or quippy. It's really good humor. And it's surprising that a movie that has such a dark tone and so many bad things that happen in this film have such great humor mixed into it to lighten the mood. And so the humor has not been this good, in my opinion, since the first Avengers. That was the last time the humor in one of these movies was that good. With the exception, I guess, of Spider-Man Homecoming. There was a lot of really good humor in Spider-Man Homecoming, but I would still say that this one does an even better job, maybe even more so than the Guardians of the Galaxy when it comes to using humor. And that is no small compliment. So props to them. I really like the way that they worked that in. It was very Marvel Universe-esque, and I appreciated it. And another thing that I was really expecting, I was expecting the movie to be a little too crowded and to not give its due diligence to the personal stories of the characters. And that's the challenge of doing any kind of superhero team-up movie. Some of the Avengers movies in the past have been kind of accused of this. And when it comes to the X-Men, when you've got like 18 mutants in a movie, it's really hard to give proper time to explain their backstory and their powers and everything. Luckily, because there is such a big build-up to this movie, you don't need a whole lot of backstory. And they really do spend a considerable amount of time on each of the Avengers, especially the core 6. I mean, it definitely pays homage to Black Panther and Ant-Man and some of the other characters. And by the way, I'm saying that specifically to explain that, because there's also flashbacks and there's a lot going on here. But the point is, even though there's a lot of crew, there's a lot of Avengers to talk about, it gives adequate time to all of them, especially the core 6, and kind of wrapping up their stories. And for the most part, even though there are things that I might have taken in a slightly different direction if I were directing it, I think in each case, they did a good job. There's one that didn't really get a lot of resolution, and I suspect that may be because he's going to wind up getting a little bit more story resolution in a different movie. Could be wrong, but that's just kind of what I'm thinking from the perspective that I saw and sort of the way that they left that storyline dangling just a little bit. But again, I don't want to give anything away here. And it's just, they did such a good job with it. It was far more personal than I expected, because you've got this big cosmic clash of really the Avengers fighting for the entire universe. And it's so big and so epic. And sometimes when movies do that, you lose the personal touch. You lose that personal connection to some of the individual characters. This movie does a really good job of balancing that. That you understand the stakes, you understand what they're fighting for. But unlike the last movie, while there's still a heavy focus on action, the action is a part of the overall story and the personal journey that these characters go through. And I think that it's really enriching, really well done. And finally, what I liked about it, and maybe this is just because I'm such a big comic book nerd, but it's a mix of so many different genres and worlds. because you've got the Guardians, which are primarily a comedy series. You've got the Avengers, which are very action focused. You've got Spider-Man, that's kind of a mix of both. You've got all these different worlds that are coming together. You've got fantasy with Thor, for example. You've got sci-fi with Guardians of the Galaxy. You've got really an old World War II war hero with Captain America. You've got sort of a Frankenstein kind of thing going on with Hulk. And what's really great about it is, and this is one of the reasons that I like comic books in general, is it's a real blend of those worlds. And so without giving away any scenes that are specific, you may have a sci-fi character at one point wielding a battle axe or a spear and riding on a horse. I mean, it's just something that's so utterly ridiculous and weird and far-fetched, but it works. And that's the reason that comics are really fascinating. One example that I thought of just now was sort of in the New Avengers, which is a comic book series that I read a while back, where it's Spider-Woman and Wolverine and Cap and Spider-Man and a bunch of these other heroes. They come across in the Savage Lands, which is primarily associated with the X-Men. They come across a barbarian character with a giant club riding a T-Rex. And Spider-Man's like, hey, I know that guy. And then Spider-Woman reacts with, he's a half-naked man riding a dinosaur. Of course you do. And that's just such a comic book thing. And that's what I like about it, is it has such a feel of a comic book. That there's this weird mashup of all these different genres and characters that are so diverse and so colorful. And I mean that, of course, in the figurative sense, that they're very colorful individuals. And somehow they make it all work together. And that's probably the thing that I would compliment the movie on the most. That they had so many moving parts and so many things to keep up with. And as far as I can tell, they did an amazing job of keeping it together and bringing it all into one experience that's very, very satisfying and very fun to watch. So props to Avengers Endgame. You guys actually pulled it off. And by the way, that's kind of my review, but I also wanted to bring up the point on a different side of this. That not only did they pull it off from a theatrical, artistic side of it, but oh my gosh, they pulled it off on the money side. 1.2 billion. Not million, billion. That's insane. To give you a frame of reference, the former record was Avengers Infinity War for the biggest opening weekend of a movie of all time. And its opening weekend was about 6 million. So Endgame doubled the previous record, which was also set by them. That is absolutely staggering. Everybody and their mama went to see this movie, and that's why I was really strict about not giving away spoilers, but honestly, I kind of feel safe giving away spoilers at this point because it seems like there's hardly anybody left that hasn't seen it. $1.2 billion, that's unbelievable. And the way that they pulled it off, I mean, it's just a great movie, and there is a branding there that Marvel movies are known for being so good, especially the Avengers movies, that they were able to make that profit because there was so much buzz surrounding it, and that's where brand names kind of come in. And I'm going to go into a sort of a slight economics lesson here, because this is a fantastic lesson in the free market. Because you had some people in this movie that by doing this and by doing the previous movies have gotten very rich. Chris Evans and Chris Hemsworth, for example, were well-known actors before this, but now they are like A-list top-tier actors. Robert Downey Jr., even though he was sort of a Class A actor before this, now he's kind of gotten into... he's been able to revise his acting career, which after his addiction and his problems with that had pretty much gone away, but with playing Iron Man, he's really been able to bring that back. And then you have some complete unknowns, like the guy who plays Black Panther, or Tom Holland, who is the new Spider-Man, that have been able to build a career off of this and become very wealthy because of their talent and because they were associated with this studio and with the franchises and the characters that people love. But there's also something else you need to remember. that there are a lot of working class people that became wealthier because of this movie, that had work because of this movie, that because people were willing to spend $1.2 billion just on opening weekend, that were able to make a lot of money because the studio had so much faith in it and because it's been so profitable for them in the past. And what's really great about that is that you're looking at a business, a product that was created, in this case, a movie, with insanely high levels of income inequality. And yet nobody on the left is decrying it, and they shouldn't. Because, yes, the income inequality was high because you had guys like Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans that made insane amounts of money on this movie. But you also have thousands and thousands of working class people that do lights and makeup and just, nothing else than running and getting the food, everything else. There's a lot of working class blue collar guys that were able to get rich off of this as well. They were able to find work and be able to be paid very well because they were the best of the best, and they knew for a project that was as big as this and as much as the quality that they needed on this. I mean, from graphic design guys to artists, costume design, there's so many people that made a lot of money off of this movie. Even though there was a lot of income inequality, everybody got richer by this movie being made. And so that really is a great lesson in the free market. The Washington Post, for example, also came out with this statistic: 0.9% increase in spending in March. And the only reason I'm using March is because there actually aren't numbers for April yet, since April isn't done. So a 0.9% increase in spending is the biggest increase in spending month to month in a decade, over 10 years. So that would have been a really big deal for this economy, considering how bad it's been and how a lot of the tax cuts and the deregulation has caused a boom in the average American having more money in their pocket. Whether you're talking about corporate tax cuts or whether you're talking about individual tax cuts or you're talking about the deregulation, these are all policies that have helped lead to a strong, bustling economy. We've had the lowest unemployment claim in about 50 years. I mean, this is a really, really big deal that we've been able to accomplish this much. And you wouldn't know it by watching the media because they constantly look for things to club Trump over the head with rather than talking about some of his accomplishments. But what's hilarious about this is a lot of these Hollywood types that talk about how much they hate Trump and how it's our responsibility as the American people to not elect him and all this other stuff. I think it was Martin Sheen that was making that case back before he was actually elected. All of these insane things that the very, very far left in Hollywood is constantly talking about. And yet, the reason they were able to have this massive opening, the biggest opening in movie history, was at least in part because Americans feel a little bit more comfortable purchasing luxuries for themselves because they got a little extra money in their pocket. There's a little more breathing room from taxation and government regulation, and the market itself is doing better, which also gives them a little more confidence in spending. And because of that, yeah, they can take their kids out for a movie. Yeah, they can go out for an evening with their spouse or their significant other and spend a little bit of money on movie tickets. And there's a pretty good lesson for that as well right here in the capital city. Because you'll remember, and I remember a time where just one movie ticket was $12, maybe $15 on opening night. I remember paying that much. And yet now, I think this last one was $7.75. And I don't remember what the prices were at AMC or at the other theater here, the Carmike, but it was pretty similar. And you sit there and ask yourself, well, that doesn't make any sense. The price of everything is going up. Why is the price of movies going down? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, better technology means lower operating cost. But part of it here, you'll notice that the movie tickets started going down when a second theater opened in Montgomery. All of a sudden, tickets that used to be $12, $15 on an opening night, like on a weekend, now they're floating around the $7, $8 mark. And you saw those prices gradually lowering because these two theaters had to compete with one another. One theater would lower their price to undercut their competition, the other theater would respond by undercutting them, and eventually they got to a price where it was more moderate and a little bit easier for everybody to afford. And so that is a great lesson in the free market, that if we believe in the invisible hand of the market, if we actually let the free market do its job and not try to regulate the mess out of everything and try to tax everything, people actually do feel a little bit better about it and feel like they can enjoy a few simple pleasures like going out to see a Marvel movie every now and then. All right, so that being said, we're going to go ahead and go to the Daily Dose of Stupid. Well, if I can get to it. There we go.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
Today's Daily Dose of Stupid comes to you via Ilhan Omar. That's always fun to have her on the show because apparently Ilhan thinks that Jesus is a Palestinian for some reason. So if you'll look at this tweet, this is one that Ilhan Omar retweeted from Omar Suleiman. I think I'm saying that right. Says, I was once asked by a relative who is a Palestinian Christian, why is the Christian right in America largely supports their oppression? Don't they know we're Christian too? Do they even consider us human? Don't they know that Jesus was a Palestinian? Okay, so here's the thing. I actually do support Palestinian Christians. I don't know of a single Christian that supports anyone's oppression that I'm aware of. And in fact, I and several other Christians here in America did a lot of work. And in my part, just donation. I didn't actually go over there because even though I would have loved to have been able to have done that, it requires a certain level of expertise that I just don't have. There was a lot of ex-military involved in it, and I'll just say that. But when it came to, for example, the Syrian civil war, there were a lot of Christians that donated millions of dollars through, for example, Mercury One, to bring a lot of those Palestinian Christians that were being persecuted during the Syrian civil war by ISIS and get them out and get them to a European country where they would be more safe. And there were a lot of efforts going towards that. And so I don't know of any Christians here in America that aren't very much in favor of Palestinian Christians' rights and trying to preserve their right to religion. So first of all, I don't really even understand the premise. I don't know where all these Christians on the right are that are supporting the Palestinian suppression. I don't know. They're pulling that out of the blue or something. But since I don't really understand what they're trying to talk about here, let's talk about this overall idea that she was retreating that Jesus was a Palestinian. Look, Jesus was not a Palestinian. There is no evidence to support that anywhere in the scripture. Jesus Christ was a Jew living in Israel. And he lived there at a time where there was Roman occupation, but he was about as Jewish as any person can be. You can look in the Gospel of Matthew, and you can look in the Gospel of Luke. And both of them, from both sides of his family, even though he didn't actually share any DNA with his earthly father Joseph, but on both sides of his family, they are both the descendants of King David and of Solomon and of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You can trace that lineage all the way back to them. And so because of that, there really is no debate that Jesus was about as Jewish as a person could get. On both sides of his family, insanely Jewish. They all were the descendants of Jews. And he was also living in the kingdom of Judea, the southern kingdom, which was Israel at the time. And so this idea that someone who was born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, and spent a lot of his adult life in Capernaum, he was a practicing Jew from a religious perspective. He followed the law perfectly, the only human being to ever do that, followed the law of Moses, adhered to its principles, went through the Torah school and had I'm sure a bar mitzvah, just like every other Jewish boy that came of age. He was culturally Jewish, he was genetically Jewish, and he was religiously Jewish in every sense of the word. You can't come up with a way that he was anything but a Jew. And yet, there are people like Ilhan Omar that are trying to suggest somehow in some way that Jesus was Jewish, or that Jesus was Palestinian and not Jewish. This is like saying that MLK or Gandhi were Irish. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, and it's so obviously untrue. So a rabbi named Michael Dixon took issue with this, and also took issue and sort of took a stab at a New York Times article that was kind of suggesting the same thing. Now, there was, when he was referencing this, a New York Times article by Eric V. Kopage that claimed that Jesus was a Palestinian. I think that we talked about this very briefly on the show. This would have been, I don't know, about 2 weeks ago. And so this piece came out by Eric Kopage that was essentially suggesting that Jesus was a Palestinian. Now, I do want to give the New York Times credit. Since then, the New York Times has actually come out and apologized for that and said that we made a correction. An earlier version of this piece said that Jesus was a Palestinian. It has been corrected to say that he was not. And what's crazy about this is, if you're looking at the New York Times piece where this was published, there is no indication here whatsoever that it was an opinion piece or an editorial. They just basically let it print as though it were fact. And so they suggested that Jesus was Palestinian. They did go back and correct it, but the point is that originally this was what they said. Now, where he's drawing this from, there is actually a small kernel of truth to it, and I want to address that right now. He says in this article, "As I grew older, I learned that fair-skinned, blue-eyed depiction of Jesus has for centuries adorned stained glass windows and altars in churches throughout the United States and Europe. But Jesus, a Jew born in Bethlehem, presumably had the complexion of a Middle Eastern man." So there is an aspect of truth to this. We often see a depiction of a long-haired, long-bearded Jesus who typically has very fair skin and blue eyes. Why? Because that's how he was depicted primarily by the Catholics. And I'm not saying that this was something that was evil, but it is historically incorrect. And he was given somewhat of an Italian look. And that is because, of course, the Vatican is located in Rome. And we see similar things. There was a famous painting, for example, of Peter, where he was working on his portion, his contribution to the New Testament, where he's writing at a desk, which would have not been, it was sort of a medieval style desk, which wouldn't have been available to him at that time. And so this is something where there's sort of historical inaccuracies when it comes to these paintings and depictions of Christ and the apostles and other biblical figures. It is accurate that he would have had the complexion of a Middle Easternish kind of man at that time, probably olive skinned, kind of closer to Mediterranean, not black like we would consider. Something that would have looked more like someone who is descended from an African culture. It would have been something more similar to the Mediterranean area, somebody that was certainly darker than he's usually depicted, but wouldn't necessarily be a black person either. And probably would have had a much shorter hair and beard, just because that was the culture of the time. So, but nonetheless, this article also claims that Jesus would have been black, which is also incorrect, and that's one of the things that I wanted to bring up. Jesus wouldn't have been a white guy, but he wouldn't have been black either. Like it says, he would have been more Middle Eastern looking. And so something probably a little bit closer to that would have been more accurate. But the real question, and we need to get to the root of the problem here, is why are they claiming this in the first place? Why do they care what race Jesus was? Why do they care what skin color Jesus Christ had? Well, it really boils down to this. The intersectionality crowd, they believe that there is something moral or immoral about race. That essentially your opinions, your thought process is more valuable and more, what's the word I'm looking for here? Valid if you are of a certain race. And they also see humanity as broken up into racial teams. And so they want as many people on their team as humanly possible. They would rather Jesus be a black man. because in some way that makes him more moral or more valid as a thinker or historical figure in their mind. Now, does it make any sense? No, but that really is what they believe. That's the problem with this intersectionality thinking. It puts the emphasis on the skin tone and the racial genetic makeup of a person rather than their ideas or their thoughts. I don't care that Jesus wasn't white. I really don't. I don't care if people want to depict Jesus as something other than white because he wasn't white to begin with. The fact that he died and shed his blood and gave his life for mine is really the only thing that I care about. The fact that I still have his teachings preserved in the gospel, that I can learn from them, that I can continue to model in my life by them, and that I know that he loved me enough to give his own life as a sacrificial offering and to be able to forgive me of my sins, that's really the only important thing that I need to know about him. You see, it's Christ's teachings, his words, his beliefs, his ideas, and his actions that are important to me, not his race. His race doesn't matter. Would he be any less my Savior, or would he be any less the Son of God if he were black? No. I'm just saying it's historically inaccurate. If Jesus had come to earth as a black man, and who knows, maybe the complexion of Middle Eastern people was a little bit darker then, and he was pretty close to a black guy. I can't say that I know that for sure. It seems unlikely based on our understanding of history. But if that were the case, wouldn't change anything. Wouldn't matter to me if you were white, black, Asian. It doesn't matter. If he were any of those things, as long as the actions were the same. Now, his genetic heritage does matter because it was prophesied and because he had to be the offspring of King David, and so it is important in that sense just because it was God fulfilling his promise to the Jewish people and to Abraham and the covenant he made with him. I'm just saying that what's really important about Christ is that he was God in the flesh, that he revealed himself to us, and he became my Savior. The race is not important. And what's so ironic about this is the people that are really hung up on what race Jesus was are actually living in contradiction to the message that Jesus taught, which is don't judge with your eyes. Look at people the way that God looks at people, as people created in his image. And that's the reason that we see in the epistles that Paul says that there is neither Jew nor free, or there's neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male nor female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. Because that's really the message of the gospel. That's the reason that we as Christians all sit together and worship together. And it was really this idea of the races intermingling being a good thing originated from the scripture. It originated with the church that Christ gave his life up for. And this idea that somehow you want certain people to be of a certain race because you feel like that makes your team more legitimate, or that there's some moral good or bad that is associated with skin color or associated with race, that's the belief of the intersectionality crowd. It's a secular belief, and it's tribalism, and it's actually old and outdated, and not something that Christ would have approved of, something that Christ actively preached against in his ministry when he was here on earth. And so those people that are trying to claim that Jesus was something that he was not, or are very concerned with what race Jesus was, those are people that are living in direct contradiction to his teachings. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's report today does come from the book of Daniel. We are continuing our look at Daniel and his life. So here's what you really need to know to understand what's going on in this passage. King Belshazzar, who is the successor of the throne to Nebuchadnezzar, is having this great feast. And there are different kings and heads of state and important people there. And as we looked at in the previous installment of this series, what has happened is he has demanded that the vessels of God that were stolen by Nebuchadnezzar from the temple, that they all be brought in and they drink out of them, and so they're enjoying the spoils of war that were stolen from God's temple. And when they're engaged in this and they're actually praising their gods and their pagan gods while doing all of this, all of a sudden a hand appears. Not a whole person, just a hand. And that hand is writing something on the wall while this big feast and banquet is going on. And this is something that, as you can imagine, is very startling. They're very confused. They can't figure out what's going on, and they also can't translate the writing. It's written in a language that they do not understand. So they panic because, of course, this is such a strange occurrence. They are very concerned about what this writing actually says, because obviously when something is written, it's supposed to convey a message, and they can't figure out what that message is because they don't understand it. So what King Belshazzar does is he calls for all the magicians and the wise men in his kingdom that are in his employ to come and translate what the hand was writing. And none of them can. And so again, as we're seeing for, I guess, a third time now in this book, when there is something that cannot be interpreted, they rely on Daniel. And we're going to see sort of the backstory of that here in this next passage in Daniel 5:11 through 12. Where it says, "There is a man in your kingdom, in whom is a spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation." Now, this is an interesting dynamic that I find here, because the queen who's speaking and giving advice to King Belshazzar is explaining, there is this guy here that will be able to interpret it, because he was the chief of magicians under your king, and we all know the explanation. We just read all the things that are attributed to Daniel. So this queen, she knows that Daniel's the guy, but it's also pretty clear that she doesn't really get it. You'll notice here one of the things that she says is, in this person is the spirit of the holy gods. These people are still thinking from a paganistic standpoint. They're still thinking that Daniel's God is one God out of many, and that he's just one of the other gods, and Daniel has the spirit, the ability to interpret, because there are the spirit of many different gods that give him some kind of special ability or authority or whatever else it may be, to be able to interpret these things and solve all of these things. They're still not thinking about it through Daniel's perspective. They're still not acknowledging the one true God of heaven. And the reason I find that so fascinating is they still know that Daniel's the guy. They're just not real sure about why that is. They're getting an incorrect understanding of where Daniel's power comes from. And I think what's significant about that is that Daniel has become so competent and virtuous that even people that don't really understand why have a pretty solid level of respect for him. I think this is something that we are supposed to emulate. That we as Christians are supposed to be so good at our job and supposed to be somebody that other people can rely on, and that we protect other people, that we're respected by others. And this is something that is talked about many times in the New Testament as well, so I'm not just coming up with this idea on my own. But this is an example of an Old Testament story where that was the case, to where even these people that are thinking from a pagan mindset, when they need help, they know Daniel's their guy. They know Daniel's the one that they're supposed to turn to. And as Christians, isn't that something that we should wish for? That people, even that aren't necessarily Christians themselves, when they have a problem or a spiritual question that they don't really know the answer to, that they have enough respect for our knowledge and our wisdom on such matters that they come to us. Because even though they're in the pagan mindset now, maybe what could happen here is that Daniel, because of his wisdom, because they know that Daniel's the one they're supposed to come to, and that he'll be the one that will be able to make this interpretation, that he'll get a chance, as he has done every time previously in this book, when he does some kind of miraculous interpretation, to proclaim God's glory and help explain to them that there is only one God, and that's where his power comes from. Doesn't seem that the message always takes, but it does give him an opportunity to spread the truth to them. And as Christians, that's something that we should implement in our lives, that other people should want to come to us, that we should make ourselves a resource to others, make ourselves available to other people, and hopefully that will end in us sharing the truth with them and them finally understanding it. That's really what's going on here, that there is a healthy level of respect for Daniel and his virtue and his abilities, so much so that they know he's the person they really need to come to with any matter dealing with something spiritual. And that puts Daniel in a position to tell them about the one true God. This also brings another point to my mind. I hear so many people say that, well, if I just lived in Bible times and I actually saw the miracles that the Bible talks about, I would have believed. Really? Because what I'm seeing here are people that have seen Daniel do amazing, miraculous things before and still don't really understand what he's saying. Because remember, up to this point in the book of Daniel, he's interpreted dreams twice. He has, even though he and his friends were drinking water and vegetables, become better and more physically fit than the people that were eating all the king's choice food. And another thing to consider, too, is the episode with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where it's very clear that God saved them from a burning furnace. Yet having seen all of these things, there are still people that were in his presence when he did all these things that saw these miracles that still don't get Daniel's central message. And that was true of Christ, and it was true of every prophet in the scripture. You see, miracles did help establish faith. It did help some people believe, but it's also important to remember that faith itself and the understanding of the principles in God's word, more than the miracles that were done, are really what's important to believe. Because many of those people that saw miracles, they faded away pretty quickly. It was the people that listened to Christ's teachings and his doctrine and started living the life that he commanded them that stuck around. Because the miracles are just a way to get somebody in the door. And it works for some people and it doesn't work for others. But we have to remember that the core message of the gospel is living the way that God wants us to and living in his image and conforming to the will of him and the image of his son. That's really the message. It's not about the miracles. It's not about the other stuff, even though those things are interesting to us. Really, at the end of the day, the core concept out of this whole thing is to make ourselves as much like Christ as possible. And that's the lesson that we really need to take away from the gospel. Not the miracles, not the flashy stuff that really draws our intrigue, but really this idea of daily living like Christ. Stay the course, friends.
This is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.